Get down! Take cover! They're everywhere! Help us!
The evidence presented before this commission leaves no room for doubt regarding the atrocities committed under your command.
On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita sat across a table from General Arthur Percival in the Ford Motor Company factory in Singapore and demanded surrender. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. Yamashita, according to the accounts of interpreters present, spoke with a bluntness that bordered on rudeness. He wanted a simple yes or no, and he wanted it immediately, because his forces were running low on ammunition and water, and he did not want Percival to discover this before the surrender was signed. Percival asked for guarantees for the civilian population. Yamashita said yes or no. Percival said yes. The fall of Singapore was the greatest military defeat in the history of the British Empire. 85,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers surrendering to a Japanese force of approximately 36,000 men, in a city that Churchill had described as an impregnable fortress, and that had fallen in 70 days of campaigning that began in the jungle of northern Malaya. Yamashita had driven his forces down the Malayan peninsula at a pace that the British defenders had not believed was possible, using the jungle terrain that had been considered impassable for armored forces, capturing supplies and fuel from the retreating British rather than waiting for his own logistics to keep pace, and exploiting the specific paralysis that the speed and the direction of his advance had produced in the British command. It was one of the most audacious and most effective military campaigns of the entire Second World War. It made Yamashita the most celebrated Japanese commander of the war, the Tiger of Malaya, as the press named him, the general who had taken a supposedly impregnable fortress in 70 days with a force outnumbered by the defenders by more than 2-1. He was executed on February 23, 1946, convicted by an American military tribunal of responsibility for war crimes committed by Japanese forces under his command in the Philippines, crimes that the tribunal found it failed to prevent or to punish in a specific legal standard that has been known ever since as the Yamashita Standard. And that has been one of the most debated legal precedents in the law of war crimes for nearly 80 years. The specific question that the Yamashita case poses, whether a military commander could be held criminally responsible for atrocities committed by troops under his command that he did not order, and that the circumstances of his command may have made it impossible for him to prevent, is one of the genuinely difficult questions in international humanitarian law, and the specific resolution of that question in the Yamashita case has been contested by legal scholars since the verdict was delivered. This is the final episode of the series. It is the story of Tomoyuki Yamashita, the greatest Japanese operational commander of the Second World War, the man who took Singapore, the man who fought a rearguard action in the Philippines against MacArthur's return, and the man who was executed for crimes of soldiers he could not control in a battle he was losing. It is also the story of the specific legal standard that his execution created, and of the questions about the laws of war and the limits of command responsibility that the standard has raised in every major conflict since. I want to ask you one last time in the final episode of this series. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the like button if this series has given you something across all 30 episodes. This is the last episode of the series that began with Yamamoto and worked through the commanders who changed the Second World War from both sides. The like button and the subscription are the things that tell the algorithm this series deserves to keep reaching people who haven't found it yet. Back to Yamashita, back to the Tiger of Malaya, and the legal question is execution left behind. The specific individuals who fought under Yamashita and against him, the Japanese soldiers who conducted the Manila massacre, the Filipino civilians and resistance fighters who survived it, the American soldiers who fought their way through Manila, and the Filipino officials and civilians who bore witness to what happened, are the human content of a story that the operational and legal analysis tends to compress into abstractions. The American soldiers who fought through Manila in February 1945. The Battle for Manila was one of the most intense urban combat operations of the Pacific War, fought street by street through a city of 1 million people. were fighting an enemy that was conducting systematic atrocities at the same time as the battle. The specific experience of advancing through a city where the civilian population was being massacred by the retreating garrison, of finding the evidence of the killings in the buildings and streets that the fighting moved through, was one of the more extreme combat experiences of the war. The Filipino resistance fighters who had been operating against the Japanese occupation throughout the war, who had maintained intelligence networks, conducted sabotage operations, and preserved the specific institutional memory of the Philippine government in exile, were the specific people who bore witness to the Manila massacre and who provided the testimony that became part of the war crimes record. Their accounts, specific, detailed, personally witnessed, are part of the historical record that the legal proceedings were drawing on. The Japanese soldiers who carried out the massacre, who murdered civilians in hospitals and churches and residential buildings across the burning city, were doing so in the specific conditions of a military situation that was collapsing around them. The specific psychology of the massacre, the combination of military defeat, institutional culture that authorized extreme violence, and the specific command breakdown of the Manila garrison, is not fully understood even now. Some of the Japanese soldiers who participated in the massacre were following specific orders from WWII's command. Some were acting on the specific authorization that the Japanese military culture provided for extreme violence against civilians. Some were responding to the specific conditions of a battle in which the distinction between combatants and civilians had collapsed in ways that the specific command breakdown of the Manila garrison had made impossible to maintain. The specific responsibility of individual Japanese soldiers for the specific acts of the massacre, as distinct from the command responsibility question at the heart of the Yamashita case, is part of the full accounting that the legal proceedings were attempting to provide. The soldiers who committed the killings were guilty of war crimes regardless of the specific question of command responsibility. The specific command responsibility question was about who among the senior officers was legally accountable for what the soldiers did. Yamashita was convicted. He was the most senior Japanese officer available for prosecution in the Philippines. Whether the specific legal standard applied to his specific situation is the question that the historical and legal record continues to engage with. The specific human beings who died in Manila in February 1945, the 100,000 Filipino civilians who are the specific human content of the legal debate, deserve to be named alongside the legal controversy. They were not abstractions in a legal argument. They were specific people, specific families, the specific population of a specific city that had been under occupation for 3 years, and that was killed in the final weeks of a war that was already decided. The specific neighborhood of Intramuros, the old walled city of Manila, built by the Spanish colonists in the 16th century, was almost entirely destroyed in the battle. The specific churches and civic buildings of the old city, the specific architecture of centuries of Philippine history, were consumed in the fighting and the burning. The specific cultural loss, the material heritage of Philippine history, destroyed in the final weeks of a war that the American forces were already winning, is part of the full accounting of what the Manila massacre cost. Yamashita had ordered the evacuation of Manila. WWII had disobeyed. The city burned. The people died. Yamashita was convicted. He was hanged. The specific chain of causation, from the Japanese decision to defend Manila against Yamashita's order, through the massacre that the defense produced to the execution that the tribunal imposed, is a specific narrative of the Yamashita case, and it is a narrative that the historical record has assembled in considerable detail. The specific question that the narrative leaves open, whether the execution was just, is one that the historical record presents without resolving. The specific people who were killed in Manila deserve the justice that the tribunal was trying to provide, whether the specific form of justice that the tribunal provided. The execution of a commander for crimes that the evidence showed he may not have known about and may not have been able to prevent was the right form is the specific question that the Yamashita Standard has generated nearly 80 years of debate about. He was a great commander. He may have been an unjustly executed man. Both things can be true. The full accounting requires holding both. That is the Yamashita War, the Tiger of Malaya, and the question is execution left behind. The 100,000 dead in Manila, the legal standard that has governed commander responsibility in every international tribunal sense, and the specific human beings on both sides who paid the specific costs of the specific decisions. That is the full accounting. The broader legal and historical question that the Yamashita Standard raises, whether the standard is just, whether it appropriately attributes responsibility for war crimes committed under chaotic command conditions, and what it means for the subsequent development of international humanitarian law, is one of the most important questions in the law of armed conflict, and it deserves direct engagement. The specific argument for the Yamashita Standard, that commanders must be held responsible for what happens under their command, because otherwise the command structure provides unlimited cover for atrocity, is a serious argument that the development of international humanitarian law since 1945 has generally supported. The specific concern that motivated the tribunals was real, that allowing commanders to escape responsibility by pleading ignorance or lack of control creates a systemic incentive to maintain ignorance and to avoid control, enabling atrocity while providing legal cover for those who could have prevented it. This concern is valid. The specific institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Army, which authorized and tolerated extreme violence against civilians and prisoners, was an institutional culture that senior commanders had created and maintained. The specific responsibility of those commanders for the institutional culture and for the atrocities that the culture produced is a real responsibility that the legal system had legitimate reasons to address. The specific argument against the Yamashita Standard, in the form it was applied in Yamashita's case, is that the standard was applied to a specific situation where the evidence of Yamashita's knowledge and capacity was genuinely ambiguous, and that convicting him on an ambiguous evidentiary record set a precedent for holding commanders responsible in situations where their actual ability to prevent the crimes was never established. Justice Murphy's dissent identified this specific problem. The tribunal had not established that Yamashita had the ability to prevent the Manila massacre, and had instead applied a standard that held him responsible simply because he was commander. The specific extension of command responsibility to situations where the commander lacked the knowledge or the capacity to prevent the crimes was an extension that went beyond the existing law of war at the time of the tribunal. The subsequent development of international humanitarian law in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, in the International Criminal Court, in the specific jurisprudence of command responsibility that has developed since 1945, has generally required both that the commander knew or had reason to know about the crimes, and that the commander had the effective power to prevent or punish them. The specific requirement of effective power is the element that was most contested in the Yamashita case, and the specific question of whether Yamashita had effective power over the Manila garrison in the specific circumstances of the February 1945 battle is the question that the subsequent scholarship has most intensively examined. The specific historical evidence that has been assembled in the decades since the trial, from Japanese military records, from the accounts of survivors, from the specific operational history of the Philippine campaign, suggests that Yamashita's command situation in February 1945 was genuinely chaotic, that his communications with the Manila garrison were severely disrupted, and that he had specifically ordered the evacuation of Manila rather than its defense. The specific disobedience of Iwabuchi, who chose to defend Manila against Yamashita's order, is established in the historical record. Whether this specific historical evidence is sufficient to establish that Yamashita lacked the effective power to prevent the massacre is a question that the legal scholars have not fully resolved. Some have concluded that the evidence shows he was genuinely unable to prevent the massacre and that his execution was therefore an injustice. Others have argued that the broader pattern of Japanese military conduct, including the Sukching massacres in Malaya, establishes a pattern of command tolerant for atrocity that the Manila massacre reflected, regardless of specific communications breakdown of February 1945. The specific political context of the Yamashita trial, MacArthur's personal involvement, the speed of the proceedings, the specific composition of the tribunal, has also been the subject of scholarly attention. MacArthur had personal reasons to want a rapid and decisive verdict. The fall of Singapore was a specific military context in which MacArthur had been forced to abandon the Philippines in 1942, and the specific defeat that Yamashita's campaign had contributed to through the broader Japanese offensive that included the fall of Singapore was part of the background of the proceeding. Whether MacArthur's personal involvement in the supervision of the tribunal produced a specific unfairness to Yamashita, whether the specific speed of proceedings, the specific evidentiary standard applied, the specific outcome, is a question that the legal scholars have addressed with a range of conclusions. The dissenting justices of the United States Supreme Court clearly believed that something had gone wrong in the proceeding. Whether what had gone wrong was sufficient to establish a fundamental injustice in the outcome, whether Yamashita should have been acquitted, or whether the specific procedural problems were not so severe as to require that result, is still debated. The Yamashita Standard, as has been applied in subsequent tribunals and codified in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, is now part of the established law of international humanitarian law. Commanders can be held criminally responsible for the acts of their subordinates if they knew or had reason to know about the acts and failed to prevent or punish them. The standard has been applied in the specific judgments of the international tribunals that have addressed war crimes since the 1990s, and has generally been applied with more attention to the specific evidentiary requirements, the knowledge and effective power, than the original Yamashita tribunal was required to meet. The specific legacy of the Yamashita case in the law of armed conflict is therefore both a positive contribution, the establishment of command responsibility as a principle of international law, and a problematic foundation, the specific application of the standard in a case where the evidentiary basis was ambiguous and the procedural standards were contested. He was a great operational commander. He was a commander of forces that committed serious atrocities. He was executed on a legal standard whose application to his specific case was contested by two justices of the Supreme Court of the country that executed him. And the legal standard that his execution established has been applied in every major international war crimes proceeding since. All of this is the Yamashita legacy, the operational genius and the war crimes and the legal controversy and the legal precedent. All of it is part of the same story. The specific people who deserve justice, the Filipinos who were killed in Manila, the Chinese civilians who were killed in the Sukching massacres, the Allied prisoners whose treatment by Japanese forces violated the laws of war throughout the Pacific Theater, deserve the specific accountability that the Yamashita trial was attempting to provide. Whether the specific form of accountability that the trial provided was just, whether Yamashita was the right person to bear the specific legal responsibility for the specific crimes, is a question that the historical and legal record continues to engage with. He died on February 23, 1946. The question his execution raised has been alive for nearly 80 years. That is a specific character of the Yamashita legacy, a question that the execution answered in a specific legal form without resolving in a way that the subsequent scholarship has accepted as fully satisfying. That is the Yamashita War, the Tiger of Malaya, the legal question, the human cost, and the specific judgment that history has rendered alongside the specific judgment that the tribunal delivered, the specific operational details of the Malayan campaign, the tactical decisions, the logistics, the specific sequence of engagements that took the Japanese forces from the Thai border to Singapore are worth examining in some detail because they establish the specific quality of Yamashita's operational mind and the specific character of the campaign that made him famous. The British military planning for the defense of Malaya was based on assumptions that reflected the specific institutional conservatism of a colonial military establishment that had not fought a major conventional war in the theater for decades. The jungle was considered impassable for armored vehicles and for large formations moving at operational tempo. The naval base at Singapore was designed to receive a relief fleet from Britain if the territory was threatened. The specific defensive preparations were oriented toward a sea-based attack on Singapore rather than an overland advance through the peninsula. Yamashita had done his homework. He had studied the specific terrain of Malaya with the attention to operational detail that the German staff training he had observed had instilled in him. He had identified the specific vulnerabilities of the British defensive concept, the assumption of jungle impassability, the orientation toward sea-based attack, the specific rigidity of a defensive system that could not respond quickly to an attack from an unexpected direction. His plan was to move faster than the British defensive system could respond, not to fight through the British defensive positions, but to go around them, to use the jungle terrain, which his forces had specifically trained to move through, to outflank the prepared defenses and force the British to abandon positions that they had not been attacked frontally. The specific tactical principle, the flanking movement that turns a defensive position without the cost of a frontal assault, is one of the oldest in military history. Yamashita's specific genius was in identifying that the jungle that the British considered an obstacle was in fact a medium through which the flanking movement could be made fastest and most decisively. The bicycles were part of this specifically Japanese innovation. The Malayan jungle tracks were passable for bicycles in ways that they were not always passable for motor vehicles. Bicycles were silent, did not require fuel that had to be brought from Japan, could be repaired by the soldiers carrying them, and move at a pace that the defenders had not anticipated. The specific image of the Japanese advance. Soldiers on bicycles, moving through jungle tracks that the British had considered impassable, appearing behind defensive positions that the British had spent weeks constructing, is one of the more vivid operational images of the entire Pacific War. The pace of the advance produced specific logistical problems that Yamashita addressed with characteristic directness. His forces were outrunning their supply lines. The fuel and ammunition that the advance required were not always available from the Japanese logistics system. His solution was to capture British supply depots rather than wait for his own logistics to catch up, to use the supplies that the retreating British were leaving behind to sustain the advance that was producing the retreating. This specific operational method, the living off the enemy, the use of captured supplies to maintain a pace that conventional logistics could not support, was the same method that other commanders of the war had used in similar situations. It was what Manstein had done in the fall of France, what the German forces had done in the early stages of Barbarossa. It required a specific combination of speed and aggression that could turn a temporary logistical advantage into an operational decision before the enemy had time to adjust. Yamashita achieved the operational decision. The British command could not adjust. Singapore fell in 70 days. The specific aftermath of the Singapore surrender included the Suk-Ching operation, the systematic massacre of ethnic Chinese civilians in Singapore and Malaya by Japanese forces in the weeks following the surrender. Estimates of the death toll range from approximately 25,000 to 50,000 people, killed by Japanese forces who identified them as potential resistance threats based on criteria that were applied with extreme ruthlessness and considerable arbitrariness. Suk-Ching was a war crime. It was organized by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, under orders that came from the Japanese command structure in Malaya. The specific question of Yamashita's personal knowledge of and responsibility for Suk-Ching is one that the historical scholarship has addressed with a range of conclusions. He was a theater commander. The Kempeitai was operating under his nominal authority. Whether he personally ordered, approved, or was even fully informed of the specific operations before they occurred is disputed in the historical record. The Singapore massacre is relevant to the Yamashita story because it establishes that the specific war crimes controversy was not confined to the Philippines, that the question of what happened under Japanese command in Yamashita's areas of responsibility was a genuine and serious question that extended back to the Malayan campaign itself. The Tiger of Malaya was not simply a brilliant military commander who was unfairly blamed for the Manila massacre. He commanded forces that committed serious war crimes in Malaya as well, and a full accounting of his career requires acknowledging this alongside the operational brilliance of the campaign. The specific question of how much personal responsibility Yamashita bore for the Suk-Ching massacres is as contested as the question of his responsibility for the Manila massacre. He was a theater commander. He had the authority to prevent the operations or to order them stopped if he knew about them. Whether he knew about them in sufficient detail and in sufficient time to have prevented them is disputed. The same pattern that characterized the Manila case, the specific ambiguity about command knowledge and command capacity, was present in the Malayan case as well. The broader pattern of Japanese military conduct in occupied territories, the Nanjing massacre in China, the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, the various massacres and atrocities that accompanied the Japanese military advance across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, reflects a specific institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Army that authorized or tolerated extreme violence against civilians and prisoners of war. The specific responsibility of individual commanders for this institutional culture, the degree to which individual commanders were personally responsible for the acts that the culture authorized, is one of the central questions of the war crimes jurisprudence that the post-war trials were trying to establish. The Yamashita case was a specific case in which the American Military Tribunal tried to establish the specific legal standard for individual commander responsibility, and the specific controversy about the standard reflects a genuine difficulty of applying individual criminal responsibility to the institutional culture of a military system. The specific individuals who died in the Manila massacre, the 100,000 Filipino civilians who were killed in February 1945, are the specific human cost of what happened in Manila in the battle's final weeks. Their deaths are the specific reason why the legal standard that the Yamashita case established matters, the specific human cost that the legal accountability was trying to address. The specific community of Manila that was destroyed, the historic center of the city, the homes and businesses and churches and institutions that had been built over centuries, was also destroyed in ways that the subsequent reconstruction could only partially address. The Manila that was rebuilt after the war was not the Manila that had existed before February 1945. The specific cultural and historical losses are part of the full accounting of the Manila massacre alongside the human casualties. Filipino civilians who survived the massacre, who hid in the ruins, who escaped through the fighting, who were protected by the specific individual humanity of Japanese soldiers who refused to participate in the killing, carried the specific memory of what they had seen and experienced throughout their lives. Their account are part of the historical record that the legal proceedings were trying to address, and they deserve acknowledgement alongside the legal debate about the specific standard that Yamashita's execution established. He was hanged. The standard was established. The Filipino dead were counted. And the specific question of whether Yamashita's execution was just, whether he had the specific legal and moral responsibility that the standard required, has been debated by legal scholars for nearly 80 years without the kind of definitive resolution that both sides of the debate would like to reach. That is a specific character of the Yamashita legacy, not the clean resolution of the operational triumph or the clean condemnation of the war criminal, but a specific ambiguity of a man who was both an exceptional military commander and a commander of forces that committed serious atrocities, whose specific personal responsibility for those atrocities is genuinely uncertain, and whose execution established a legal standard that has been both praised as essential and criticized as unjust. The full accounting requires holding all of this simultaneously, the operational genius and the war crimes, the specific ambiguity of command responsibility in a losing battle, the specific human cost of the atrocities, and a legal legacy that has outlasted Yamashita by nearly 80 years. That is the Yamashita War. Tomoyuki Yamashita was born in Kochi Prefecture on the island of Shikoku in 1885, the son of a country doctor, and had followed the specific path of the ambitious Japanese officer's generation. Military school, the army, the specific combination of operational skill and institutional maneuvering that advancement in the Imperial Japanese Army required. He had served in the First World War, had studied in Germany and Austria in the interwar years, and had developed a specific admiration for the German military system, its operational doctrine, its staff training, its specific approach to combined arms warfare that would inform his own approach to command. His career had not been untroubled. The specific institutional politics of the Imperial Japanese Army, the faction conflicts between the Imperial WWII faction and the Control faction, the specific dynamics of the military political system that produced the February 26th incident in 1936, had left marks on his career that the brilliant Malayan campaign would eventually partially erase. He had been associated with officers of the Imperial WWII faction, which had been defeated in the factional struggle, and he had spent the years between 1936 and 1941 in assignments that reflected the institutional wariness of a general staff that regarded him as politically unreliable. The assignment to command the 25th Army for the Malayan campaign was therefore not the command of a general at the height of his institutional favor. It was the assignment of a capable officer to a mission that the high command apparently regarded as achievable but not of the highest strategic priority. The capture of Malaya and Singapore was important for its resources and its strategic position, but it was a secondary theater compared to the Central Pacific and the China theater. Yamashita made the secondary theater into one of the most dramatic campaigns of the entire Pacific War. His operational concept was simple and its execution was demanding. The British defenses were organized on the assumption that the jungle of northern Malaya was impassable for a major advance, that the main Japanese attack would come by sea against the fortified coast of Singapore Island. Yamashita planned an overland advance through the jungle, moving faster than the defenders believed was possible, outflanking the prepared defensive positions that the British had constructed to stop a more conventional advance. The specific instrument of this advance was a bicycle. Thousands of Japanese soldiers advancing to the Malayan jungle on bicycles, captured from the retreating British and from the local population, moving faster on the jungle tracks than the British had thought infantry could move without motorized transport. The image of the Japanese advance on bicycles, one of the more memorable tactical details of the entire Pacific War, is part of the specific operational innovation that made the Malayan campaign so different from what the British had prepared for. The British command was repeatedly outflanked. The specific combination of Japanese speed and British institutional rigidity, the inability of the British command to respond quickly to the unexpected direction and pace of the advance, produced a series of defensive collapses that took the Japanese forces from the Thai border to Singapore in approximately 70 days. Each time the British established a new defensive line, the Japanese had already moved around its flank. Each time the British attempted a counterattack, the Japanese had already moved past a position it was designed to recapture. The defense of Singapore itself. The final 2 weeks of fighting on the island after the causeway connecting it to the mainland was captured was conducted under circumstances that made the specific outcome almost inevitable. The water supply of the island depended on reservoirs in the western part of the island that the Japanese had captured. The civilian population of approximately 1 million people was consuming supplies faster than they could be replenished. The military situation, Japanese forces advancing from multiple directions, British defenders unable to mount effective counterattacks, was increasingly hopeless. Percival's surrender on February 15th was the appropriate military response to a situation that had become strategically impossible. Whatever Churchill's personal views about fighting to the last, the specific conditions of surrender, the 7 minutes, the demand for yes or no, the bluntness that Yamashita later said reflected his operational anxiety about his own supply situation rather than personal arrogance, are part of the historical record that has been examined and analyzed extensively. Yamashita's subsequent campaign in the Philippines. The defense of the Philippine Islands against the American return that began with MacArthur's Leyte Gulf landing in October 1944 was a very different kind of command from a Malayan triumph. He was commanding a defensive rearguard action with forces that were increasingly cut off from supply, communication, and reinforcement against an American military that had overwhelming air, naval, and logistical superiority. The specific conditions of the Philippine campaign, the fragmentation of Japanese forces across multiple islands, the breakdown of communications between Tokyo and theater, the specific chaos of a command attempting to conduct organized resistance while simultaneously managing the evacuation of civilians, and the disintegration of the institutional framework of Japanese military administration were the conditions in which the atrocities were committed that the subsequent war crimes tribunal would hold Yamashita responsible for. The Manila Massacre of February 1945, in which Japanese forces under the command of Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi killed approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians in an orgy of violence that included mass murder, rape, and the systematic destruction of the city, was a central crime in the Yamashita case. The specific question was whether Yamashita had ordered the massacre, had known about it and failed to stop it, or had been so thoroughly cut off from communication with the Manila garrison that he could not have known about it in time to prevent it. The evidence at the trial was ambiguous on the specific question of what Yamashita knew and when he knew it. His defense argued that it specifically ordered the evacuation of Manila rather than its defense, that while Buchi had disobeyed his orders, and that the breakdown of communications and the specific conditions of the battle for the Philippines had made it physically impossible for him to know about or prevent the massacre. The American Military Tribunal, convened under MacArthur's authority, convicted him on the standard that a commander was responsible for the acts of his troops if he had the power to prevent those acts or to punish those who committed them. The specific application of this standard to Yamashita, whose power to prevent the Manila Massacre was precisely what was in dispute, was a specific legal reasoning that Justice Murphy of the United States Supreme Court, in a dissent to the Supreme Court's refusal to review the case, described as a grave miscarriage of justice. Justice Murphy's dissent and Justice Rutledge's separate dissent are among the most important documents in the law of war crimes, not because they necessarily reached the right conclusion about Yamashita's specific guilt, but because they identified the specific legal problem with the standard being applied. A commander was being held responsible for acts that the evidence showed he may not have known about and could not have prevented. The specific extension of command responsibility to situations where the commander lacked the knowledge or the capacity to prevent the crimes was an extension that the existing law of war did not clearly support. He was hanged on February 23, 1946. He died with a specific dignity that the Japanese officer tradition required, composed, expressing regret for the sufferings of the Filipino people, maintaining that he had done his duty as a soldier. Whether that duty had included the deaths of 100,000 Filipino civilians in a city whose massacre he may not have been able to prevent is the specific question that the historical and legal scholarship has been engaging with ever since. The Yamashita Standard, the legal precedent established by his conviction that a commander can be held responsible for the acts of his troops if he failed to prevent or punish them, has been applied in subsequent war crimes cases, including the Nuremberg successor trials and more recent international tribunals. The specific debates about the appropriate scope of command responsibility have continued in every major conflict since Yamashita's execution, and the specific questions his case raised about the limits of individual responsibility in the chaos of a losing battle have not been fully resolved. He was the greatest Japanese operational commander of the Second World War. He took Singapore in 70 days. He fought the rear guard action in the Philippines with the forces and the communications available to him. He was convicted of responsibility for crimes committed by troops he could not control in a battle he was losing. He was executed by the army of the country he had defeated in the greatest military victory of his career. The full accounting of the Yamashita story requires holding all of these things simultaneously: the operational genius of the Malayan campaign, the specific circumstances of the Philippine command, the specific atrocities of the Manila massacre, the legal debate about the Yamashita Standard, and the specific human beings, the 100,000 Filipino civilians whose deaths are the specific human cost of what happened in Manila in February 1945. That is the full accounting of the Yamashita War, the Tiger of Malaya, the Defender of the Philippines, the execution, and the legal question that has outlasted him by nearly 80 years. That is the Yamashita War. That is where the series ends. The specific comparison between the Yamashita case and other command responsibility cases of the post-war trials, and the specific ways in which the Yamashita Standard has been developed and refined in subsequent jurisprudence, is worth examining because it establishes a specific legal legacy of the case in the development of international humanitarian law. The Nuremberg successor trials, the 12 trials conducted by the American military after the main Nuremberg proceedings, which addressed categories of Nazi criminality that the main trial had not fully covered, included specific judgments on command responsibility that drew on and developed the Yamashita Standard. The High Command Trial, which addressed the responsibility of senior German army commanders for war crimes committed on the Eastern Front, applied a command responsibility standard that was somewhat more demanding in its evidentiary requirements than the original Yamashita Tribunal had applied. The specific judgments in the High Command Trial established that command responsibility required actual knowledge of the crimes, not simply the fact of command, and that the commander must have had the effective power to prevent or punish the crimes to be held responsible for them. This more demanding standard was closer to what Justice Murphy had argued was required in his Yamashita dissent, and it reflected the specific concern that the Yamashita Tribunal had applied too broad a standard. The subsequent development of command responsibility in the international tribunals of the 1990s and 2000s, the ICDY, the ICTR, and eventually the ICC, has generally followed the more demanding standard of the Nuremberg successor trials rather than the original Yamashita Standard. The Rome Statute, which established the ICC, requires that the commander knew or should have known about the crimes and failed to take all necessary and reasonable measures to prevent or repress them. The specific requirement of reasonable measures, which acknowledges that the commander's effective power may be limited by circumstances, is a recognition of exactly the concern that Yamashita's defense had raised. If the Rome Statute standard had been applied to Yamashita's specific situation, the breakdown of communications with the Manila garrison, the specific order to evacuate rather than defend the city, the specific incapacity to communicate with the garrison in the hours when the massacre was occurring, the specific outcome might have been different. Whether it would have been different is a question that the legal scholars have addressed without reaching a definitive conclusion, because the specific evidentiary questions about what Yamashita knew and when remain contested. The specific question of whether Yamashita was justly executed, whether he had the specific knowledge and specific effective power that the more demanding standard would require, is one that the historical record presents with genuine ambiguity. The evidence supports the conclusion that he had ordered the evacuation. It is less clear that he had the effective power to prevent Iwabuchi from disobeying the order. It is less clear still that he knew about the massacre in time to prevent it. The specific ambiguity is the legacy of the case, not the clean resolution of justice served, but the genuine legal and historical question that the execution left behind. He was convicted. He was executed. Whether conviction was just is the question that nearly 80 years of scholarship has addressed without resolving. The full accounting of the Yamashita War requires acknowledging the question as genuinely open, not because Yamashita was certainly innocent, but because the specific evidence does not establish the specific elements of the more demanding standard that subsequent jurisprudence has required, and because the specific political context of the tribunal raises legitimate questions about whether proceedings were designed to find the answer that the evidence supported. He was hanged on February 23, 1946. The Filipino people whose deaths his forces had caused deserved justice. Whether the specific form of justice delivered by the specific tribunal, in the specific circumstances, was a right form is a question that the Yamashita Standard continues to generate. That is the Yamashita legacy. The final accounting of this series, the specific place of the Yamashita episode in the 30-episode narrative that has traced the commanders who changed the Second World War, is worth a moment's reflection, because the Yamashita story brings the series to an ending that is appropriately complex. This series began with Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral who predicted that attacking America would destroy Japan, who planned Pearl Harbor anyway, and who was killed by the intelligence service of the country he had spent years at Harvard learning to respect. The series ends with Yamashita, the Japanese general who achieved the greatest military victory of the Pacific War, and who was executed for crimes that the legal and historical record has not definitively established he was personally responsible for. Both men were extraordinary military professionals in the service of an imperial system that committed atrocities. Both were destroyed by the country they had attacked. Yamamoto by the intelligence that ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville, Yamashita by the tribunal that convicted him under a contested legal standard. Both deserve to be understood as specific human beings in specific historical circumstances, not as the simple symbols of enemy evil or of military excellence that the straightforward war narrative might reduce them to. This series has tried, across 30 episodes, to see the commanders of the Second World War as specific people in specific circumstances, making specific decisions with specific consequences, and to tell their stories with the full complexity that their specific humanity requires. The Yamashita episode is perhaps the most complex of all, the greatest operational triumph of the Japanese military, the most serious war crimes question in Pacific theater, and the most contested legal precedent of the post-war trials, all in the same man's story. He took Singapore in 70 days with a force outnumbered by the defenders. He commanded the defense of the Philippines against the American return with forces that were cut off from supply and communication. His command was associated with serious atrocities in both theaters. He was convicted on a legal standard whose application to his specific situation was contested by 2 Supreme Court justices. He was executed on February 23, 1946. The Tiger of Malaya, the defender of the Philippines, the legally contested execution, and the Yamashita Standard that has governed command responsibility in every international war crimes tribunal since. This is the full accounting of the 30 commanders this series has examined. They were right and wrong in different measures. They were brilliant and cruel and brave and cowardly and honest and dishonest and exceptional and ordinary, sometimes all of these things in the same career. They were human beings caught up in the largest and most destructive conflict in human history, making decisions that shaped the lives and deaths of millions of people. The series has tried to honor all of this, the operational brilliance and the moral failures, the courage and the cruelty, the specific decisions and the specific costs, by telling the stories as completely and as honestly as the historical record allows. The soldiers who served under these commanders deserved this kind of telling. The civilians who paid for the decisions these commanders made deserved this kind of telling. The commanders themselves deserved it, in the sense that honest history treats its subjects as specific human beings rather than as symbols. Yamashita was a specific human being. He was a great operational commander. He commanded forces that committed atrocities in Malaya and in the Philippines. He was convicted of a legal responsibility whose specific application to his case remains contested. He was executed. The question his execution raised has been alive for nearly 80 years. That is where the series ends, with the legal question still open, with the operational genius and the war crimes in the same story, with a specific human being who was both. That is the Yamashita War. That is the final accounting of the series. From Yamamoto at the beginning, the admiral who told the truth and was overruled, to Yamashita at the end, the general who won the greatest victory of the Pacific War and was executed for the crimes that followed. The series has tried to trace what the Second World War actually was. Not the simple story of Allied triumph and Axis evil, but the specific story of specific human beings making specific decisions in specific circumstances, whose full complexity requires the kind of sustained engagement that 30 episodes can only begin to provide. The war is over. The commanders are dead. The questions they left behind are still with us. That is the full accounting. That is the Yamashita War. The specific cultural memory of Yamashita in Japan and in the Philippines, the two countries most directly connected to the story, reflects the specific ways in which the same historical events can be processed very differently by the specific communities that experience them. In Japan, Yamashita's reputation has been shaped by the specific dynamics of post-war Japanese memory of the Pacific War. He is remembered as one of the war's greatest military commanders, the specific achievement of the Malayan campaign, the specific drama of the Singapore surrender, the specific brilliance of the advance through the jungle, with the specific quality of professional honor that the Japanese military tradition attached to exceptional military achievement. The war crimes controversy and the execution have been addressed in the Japanese historical memory with varying degrees of engagement, reflecting the broader ambivalence of post-war Japanese engagement with the Pacific War's atrocities. In the Philippines, Yamashita's memory is inseparable from the Manila massacre, from the specific human cost of what Japanese forces did to Filipino civilians in February 1945. The specific Philippine memory of the Manila massacre is one of the most painful episodes in Philippine national memory, and Yamashita's name is connected to it in a specific way that a commander's name becomes connected to the worst thing that happened under his command. The specific tension between the Japanese memory, which emphasizes the operational achievement, and the Philippine memory, which emphasizes the human cost of the atrocities, is part of the broader tension in Asian historical memory of the Pacific War that continues to produce specific diplomatic and political frictions in contemporary world. The specific monuments and memorials to the Manila massacre in the Philippines, the markers at the sites where the killings occurred, the specific documentation of what happened preserved in the National Archives, are part of the ongoing acknowledgement that the Philippine national memory maintains of what was done to the Filipino people in February 1945. The specific connection between these memorials and the Yamashita Standard, the legal precedent that the execution of the Japanese commander established, is part of the ongoing effort to maintain both the historical memory and the legal accountability that the historical memory requires. The specific Japanese soldiers who committed the Manila massacre, whose individual responsibility for specific acts was never fully adjudicated in the legal proceedings, are the other dimension of the accountability question that the Yamashita case left unresolved. Command responsibility is one form of accountability. Individual responsibility for specific acts is another. The specific soldiers who committed the killings in Manila were individually responsible for those killings regardless of the specific question of command responsibility. Their individual accountability was not the subject of the Yamashita trial, and the specific legal proceedings that addressed it were less extensive and less prominent than the Yamashita case. The full accounting of the Manila massacre requires acknowledging both dimensions, the command responsibility that the Yamashita case addressed, and the individual responsibility of the soldiers who committed the specific acts that the command responsibility standard was applied to address. Both forms of accountability were imperfect in the specific proceedings that followed the war. The specific imperfection is part of the honest historical record. He was hanged. The specific soldiers who committed the massacre were not all tried. The specific questions about command responsibility remain contested. And the 100,000 Filipinos who died in Manila in February 1945 deserve acknowledgement in every accounting of what the Pacific War was and what it cost. The Yamashita War ends with the same ambiguity that has characterized the most honest episodes of the series. The recognition that the full truth of what the Second World War was and what it produced does not resolve into comfortable narratives that the popular memory of the war prefers. The operational genius and the war crimes. The legal standard and the contested application. The executed commander and the unresolved question. The war is over. The commanders are dead. The questions remain. That is the Yamashita War. That is the final episode of this series. And that is where the full accounting of the Second World War's commanders comes to its honest and appropriate end. Not with a clean resolution, but with a specific complexity that the historical record requires. The Tiger of Malaya, the fall of Singapore, the Manila massacre, the Yamashita Standard, the execution on February 23, 1946. All of it belongs in the same accounting. All of it is the Yamashita War. The specific place of the Yamashita case in the broader history of the Pacific War's legal reckoning. The Tokyo trials and the other proceedings that attempted to establish accountability for the Japanese military's conduct in the war is worth noting because the Yamashita case was in some ways a template for the broader accountability effort. The Tokyo trials, formerly the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which ran from 1946 to 1948, addressed the senior Japanese political and military leadership for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The specific defendants included prime ministers, senior military officers, and ideological leaders of the wartime Japanese government. The specific judgments, 7 death sentences, 16 life sentences, and 2 shorter terms, were delivered in November 1948. The Tokyo trials addressed the command responsibility question at the highest level of the Japanese government and military. The specific judgments held that the senior Japanese leadership was responsible for the systematic war crimes that had been committed by Japanese forces throughout the Pacific War, not because each defendant had personally ordered each crime, but because the institutional culture of the Japanese military, under their leadership, had authorized and tolerated those crimes. This application of command responsibility to the highest institutional level, to the specific culture that had produced the Nanjing Massacre and the Bataan Death March and the Manila Massacre and the dozens of other documented war crimes, was a specific extension of command responsibility principle that the Yamashita case had established. The specific question of whether the Tokyo defendants had the specific knowledge and the specific effective power to prevent the crimes is one that the legal scholars have addressed with the same range of conclusions that the Yamashita case produced. The broader Pacific War accountability effort, which included not only the Tokyo trials and the Yamashita case, but dozens of other proceedings before Allied military tribunals, produced hundreds of convictions and dozens of executions. The specific adequacy of this accountability effort, whether it reached the right people, whether it applied the right standards, whether it produced justice for specific victims of the specific crimes, is a question that the historical and legal scholarship continues to address. The Filipino victims of the Manila Massacre, the Chinese victims of the Nanjing Massacre, the Allied prisoners who died on the Bataan Death March and in the prison camps throughout the Pacific, the Korean and Chinese and other Asian civilians who were subjected to forced labor and systematic brutality throughout the Japanese occupation. These are the specific people who deserve the specific accountability that the post-war proceedings were attempting to provide. Whether the proceedings provided adequate accountability, whether the specific punishments imposed reached the specific people who bore the specific responsibility for specific crimes, is a question that the historical record presents without resolving. What the historical record does establish is that the specific crimes were real, the specific victims were real, and the specific accountability effort was imperfect in ways that the scholarship has documented. Yamashita was hanged. He may or may not have been the most appropriate object of the specific legal accountability for the specific crimes. The Filipino victims of Manila deserve justice regardless. Whether the specific execution of the specific general was the right form of the justice they deserved is a specific question that has been open for nearly 80 years. That is the Yamashita War, the Tiger of Malaya, the Manila Massacre, the legal controversy, the execution, and the question that remains. And that is the full accounting of the series. 30 episodes, 30 commanders, the full complexity of the Second World War's human cost and human achievement held simultaneously in the same telling. The war is over. The questions it left behind are not from Yamamoto to Yamashita, from the admiral who told the truth and was overruled to the general who won the greatest victory and was executed for the crimes that followed. The full complexity of the Second World War's commanders, held in the same telling, with the same insistence on the full truth. That is the Yamashita War. That is the end of the series.